So would like to take attendance.
Yeah, I see West, Shaw, Crow, Hebert, and Bachhuber.
Okay, so the first item of business then is approval of the minutes from March 20th. Need a motion for approval.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Minutes are approved. And the first item of business is the Leo Cancer Care Site. Fee and lieu request. And is there gonna be a presentation or just you?
No, Bruce Holler is on remotely, and I'll just say a couple of things. So this is an aerial view of the site. Costco parking lot is right here, UW Health up in here. And this, they're gonna put a small building addition over the top of this existing parking.
Okay.
And then they're gonna build more parking out here. And Bruce, I think you can give just a brief description.
Yeah, so pretty much what Eric said, yeah, the little orange area is the building expansion where that roof will get collected into the roof drain system of the existing building. And then everything else in the blue and the green is just surface runoff to a couple of bio beds. I don't know if you recall, but this area of Discovery Springs has got some really questionable soils, real soft clays. And in the existing parking lot on the south end of the gray stalls there, we've got a long, narrow bioretention basin that we're using for sediment control because we ended up paying fees in lieu of at the time when the initial project happened. So we ended up lining that bottom of that. So we basically just had engineered fill to filter the sediment. And I'm kind of going on that. That's pretty much what we're proposing here on these other two basins to basically provide TSS. And we will get some infiltration, certain credit with the green space, but primarily because of the soils, we're requesting the fee in lieu of, in this case. The confluence pond handles the peak control.
Yeah. And if he's, this currently now is a surcharge pile of soils.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So this area was grandfathered in with the confluence fund?
Yes.
For rate control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, question, the building expansion, is that just totally gonna be on top of a current parking surface? So
Right. We're pulling out asphalt.
Okay.
It's essentially sitting right on top of asphalt right now.
So no change in imperviousness there.
Correct.
And do these have under drains then to get the water out of the basins?
Right. We just
Oh, I see.
yeah, there's under drains in each one of them. So
Does water drain out of that? I noticed in Costco, it just stands there all the time.
well, that was the idea that that was the hope that was the thought process was, well, let's put some under drains in the event that it doesn't, at least you got the under drains to help carry that water away. We do have each one of these structures. We have a standpipe in each pond, and we do also have emergency drawdown. A little clean out where you can just take the cap off if needed, if water does end up sitting there. That I think what we tend to do is maybe keep that open until they get the vegetation established pretty well and get a good root system going. And then we just plug it back up and see how it works.
So the overflow will go into the South Fork.
Yeah,
correctly?
Right.
both of those basins will probably end up with a liner for the plumbing code,
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah.
I noticed the fees in lieu of for infiltration, you cross that out, it's just for recharge.
I did, and they only have to pay fees in lieu for the worst of the two parameters. So Bruce had shown it as he added them together. So, yeah, I wanted to get that up now, but it's only the $2,000 that he needs to pay.
So what do we need tonight? A motion for approval?
Yeah, recommend approval of fees in lieu.
I'll move that.
I can.
Oh. Is that a motion by Jim?
Yeah,
Okay. Second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
aye,
And a motion's carried.
Thank you.
thanks, Bruce.
Thanks, Bruce.
You're welcome.
Next item of business then is the flood mapping amendment. Steve's here to talk about.
Yeah, Steve, if you wanna just describe and
Sure.
you can have a seat at the table.
Sure, that'd be great.
The continuing saga of the floodplain maps, this has been a while. Yeah, I won't be at it for 50 years. But you might recall, and actually, some of you are newer to the commission, but in 2019, I was hired by the city of Middleton to update floodplain maps. The old flood insurance rate maps are date back to about 1990. I think, Eric, does that sound right?
Yeah, about
It's a
the,
few decades old. We know there's better data out there. The world has changed. There's essentially no floodplain mapped on the South Fork. And this was right after the big flood of 2018, which the flooding impacts didn't match the maps, and the city thought, well, we should provide some updated information. So we did a study, computer modeling, produce some updated maps, and then it's been used for a few things, kind of project specific uses, but the step that was not taken was updating with FEMA, the flood insurance study, and the flood insurance rate maps. So it's sort of the official floodplain maps that then get incorporated into the city of Middleton zoning. And it's been a lot of discussion about that. Last year, we had a small scoping project to sort out some of the questions involved and what would that look like? And what would it cost? And what are some of the pros and cons for the city? And last August, we presented that to the commission. The opinion commission at that time was we should proceed with updating the maps with FEMA. And that's essentially where things have left off. That scope of work did include a city council presentation. Eric, you just said it, you used that remaining budget for a few other kind of odds and ends that were helpful at the time on the floodplain issue.
Let me interrupt a little.
Please do.
There was a similar proposal that Steve gave us last year, maybe in February,
Yeah.
That had 3 phases similar to this. The first phase was eventually all that was approved by finance, and it was to kind of do some more legwork to figure out how we could scope the rest of the work. The only thing he didn't accomplish was this presentation to council. And that's because we use those dollars to start thinking about what Madison was potentially doing with all of their projects, and if they were, actually gonna do what they promised, or if they were sequencing things correctly. Still waiting on that answer. So there's a task in here to handle any adjustments we might need to make based on what Madison is up to.
Right.
But this second phase is in line with that second phase from last year.
Yeah. Last year, we had a fairly broad cost range
Yeah, you gave us a range.
because of all the things we didn't know. Having gone through last year's process, we're able to more precisely scope that cost now that some of those questions have been answered. So this will follow up on many of the technical issues that we've been talking about in the last few years, the flood storage areas, how to handle those, whether or not to include those storage areas in different places. And you've experienced the rabbit hole of how many loose ends there are and how many questions there are. And sometimes I think I've probably melted your brains talking too much about them, but we've got answers on that. Well, we have answers on many of those things. There's still some dangling issues that we will figure out with DNR and how DNR is going to handle this as we go. We haven't got concrete answers from Chris Olds and colleagues at DNR and everything, but they have been very helpful. So the next step, this phase 2, is updating the work from 2020 and the maps that go along with that modeling based on the new information that we have and discussions with the commission to get to the point of having a product that is ready to submit to FEMA. The FEMA submittal process is phase 3, which Eric is not recommending funding at this time. And because we know a little bit more about that after talking with the DNR folks. And because one important thing is in the FEMA lingo, typical revision of floodplain map is called the letter of map revision, the LOMR acronym, which is usually a 6-month to a year process. In this case, because the watershed maps cover such a big area, it goes through a longer process with FEMA. They call it a physical map revision. Don't really know where the physical term comes from, but PMR, physical map revision, is what they call it. And that's a multiple year process, typically 3 or 4. So unfortunately, that prolongs the time, and along with that, presumably adds cost to that FEMA approval process. And we identified that as a possibility in last year's proposal. And I guess we don't have an ironclad answer from FEMA on that, but in talking with DNR, they're quite confident the scale of this project far exceeds that threshold for FEMA to go to the more extended process. I guess sort of backing up, one of the first steps here in the phase 1 that you're not seeing would be to do that council presentation and get the direction from Common Council whether to proceed with the remapping effort or not, possibly.
So the presentation you made was just an open,
No, he never made the final presentation to council. And we used the fees that we had approved to do some other investigation.
I remember a presentation you made, but I guess it wasn't to the council that time.
No, it's correct.
That was just a public hearing.
Oh,
No.
yeah, so there wasn't in 2020, so 4 years ago, I did present to Common Council. When we
Yeah.
did the initial flood study there in January of 2020. And I only remember this because I'm looking back at the notes, but there was a public informational meeting in conjunction with WRMC meeting. So I presented there and then did a streamlined version of that to Common Council a couple of weeks later in February 2020. But it's 4 years ago. So I think the thought here, Eric, is city
Eric,
needs
were you
direction to go ahead down this
I
route.
was the only one that would have heard it at council.
Yeah, I've listened to Steve's presentation on tape, or on YouTube.
I don't remember that much of it, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I do have one
It could be a good
question
time.
from the flood that I'm sure you've taken care of it. Where the railroad track is
Yeah,
and all that water backed up against it and blew it all out.
yeah.
Are the culverts big enough to sort of help that from not happening again?
They are upsized, improved.
Yeah,
Um,
but are they big
You know,
enough?
I don't have an, honestly, I don't have an answer. You know, are they big enough? I mean, they're bigger,
Yeah,
which certainly helps.
They're big enough for the 100-year flood, as it's, if we have a 500-year flood again, or
Yeah.
1,000-year flood,
Yeah,
that's what I'm
honestly,
worried about.
don't know. I mean, sometimes those culverts get plugged with
Yeah,
logs and other debris, and I don't know if that's what happened.
part of the problem is it's not a dam, even though you got culverts, that's compacted dirt
Yeah,
out there, so, that's the argument from day one, it's not a dam and shouldn't be treated as a dam.
yep. And not to dive into the details, but how to handle that in the floodplain maps is one of these dangling issues.
yeah.
You know, do you map assuming that it works as a flood control dam? Or do you map it assuming it's not there because it might blow out again?
I just, having looked at it the day after,
Yeah, it's stunning.
I've got some horrible pictures of what was done.
I remember looking at it.
But again,
Yes.
we're not,
I have a
We're not
lot
gonna-
of concern of that needs to be truly functional or increase the floodplain. Assuming that it's not going to be functional.
Yeah, and in August, that was the recommendation of the commission, was to assume that that embankment's not operating as a dam. So, yeah, and Jim, I think, sorry, I think you,
well,
Had a
the comment is we're not designing to convey the 2018 rainfall runoff. That's, we just, that would, that'd be out of this ridiculous, crazy sizing of everything to do that. So anyway.
And this proposal is just to do the mapping work.
Yeah, we're not,
not,
I do have a
uh,
question. You're gonna present to the council in phase one. Council will make a decision on whether to proceed with an actual full-blown FEMA remap or physical map, as you say, or just to use it for our city purposes. And my question is, does it make more sense to present to the council the information after you've done the phase two revisions, in other words, accounted for Tribeca and things like that, and then get their response? I'm just curious the logic of getting a response from the council before the map's been fully updated.
Jim, I think the scope of what would make sense for us to do in phase two would be different if the council decided we don't want to go through the FEMA remapping. There still may well be things to do, but it'd be different. But suppose the city council said, let's just use the maps that we've got for local zoning and information for the citizens, but let's not go through the FEMA process. One option would be you could take the maps that were produced in 2020 and use those as better information. Or, as you were saying, you could do some things like add in Tribeca, maybe some other updates, but some of the tasks that we have in phase two are really oriented just for approval from FEMA. How do you handle the flood storage areas and that sort of thing? So I think the phase two scope would be reduced if the direction from the council was, we don't want to go through the FEMA process.
All right.
Wasn't our recommendation to go through the FEMA process?
Yes,
Yeah,
Yeah.
the commission's was.
so I think they made a mistake not to do that.
Yeah.
The
Randall,
previous one was like 1,200 CFS. Now we're looking at 2,100, so that's a big difference.
It is.
It would be a
I got a
mistake.
question
And-
for you.
Well, again, I'm not disagreeing with it, with going through the FEMA process. But if I understand correctly, the city could still use all this information for its own zoning and regulatory purposes without going through the FEMA map revision process.
That's correct. DNR's confirmed that. DNR's flagged, there's a little bit of a gray area. The National Flood Insurance Program run by FEMA does have language to the effect of, if a community has better information about flooding, they should incorporate that into the maps. But, the FEMA police gonna show up and kick the city of Middleton out of the National Flood Insurance Program? I don't think so. And given the scale of the project, this is not a small revision. It's very big,
Right.
time consuming. So, that's a consideration, but I think it is, all our information is that the city really does have a choice on how to handle this.
One of the drawbacks would be a bank giving a loan to a developer would look back at the previous one as far as giving them a loan, right?
Right,
They
No,
wouldn't necessarily have the updated information. They
right.
really wouldn't be required to, so they could give a loan not knowing for sure they're in the floodplain.
Yep, that's correct. And actually heard from one developer in the city who said, geez, I think it'd be really confusing to have two sources of information.
yeah, I understand.
On the other hand, it's still an option and, you could imagine ways to get the word out to the local public, but
You hope,
that,
Yeah,
it's bound to happen sometimes, right?
yeah.
what's the difference in cost between the two options?
Well, the cost could range from virtually nothing because you've got maps that we produced
Right,
already. To, the scope here that we're proposing is $43,000. In the FEMA process, the number we have in here is, maybe it could be $60,000. It's an unknown, but it's a 3 or 4 year process. And that's a lot of back and forth with FEMA. Even on simple projects, it's always the case. An engineer submits to FEMA on behalf of a municipality or a developer. They've got contracted engineers who pore over all the details and will have comments and questions, and you go back and forth multiple times usually,
so,
and the meter's running, so to
So if we
speak.
assume
I'm
Steve's
looking-
estimate is correct, it's a $60,000 increase, which I'm not arguing that that's not a wise use of the money. I'm just saying that's what the difference is.
Well, possibly, Jim, if phase 2 could be less. If you said, let's update a few key things in the maps
Yeah.
and then use them for local information, you probably wouldn't spend the full $42,000. But still, you're right, it's, $60,000 to $80,000 saving, presumably, for not
It-
the FEMA
It's a
update
4-year
process.
process. Yeah,
will
it's-
give us the best information for local contractors
Um,
so that they can acquire the bank loans they need.
the most straightforward thing is to have the FEMA maps updated for the reason described. You could make an argument that the maps might actually be slightly more accurate. If you don't have to go through all of the hoops, so to speak, for FEMA and DNR. And really, some of the main reason is that the flood storage areas, they have a real impact on how flooding occurs in the land. As we've talked about in the past, if you want to avoid the restrictions that go to the flood storage areas, then you assume that water passes through and the flooding is more extensive. So I think in reality, the updated FEMA maps will have more extensive floodplain somewhat than, our best estimate of what's actually happening out on the ground. You could say it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Because it's more protective. But that's one advantage of not going through the FEMA process. I'd say it's probably a small advantage, but there's a few areas where it can make quite a difference.
And since 100-year floods tend to be increasing a little bit on that.
Yeah.
A little bit extra safety is probably a good idea.
Yeah, that's right. And I think some communities are going to using the 200-year flood. It's not a requirement that the base flood is the 100-year. The base flood being the one that's used to set the flood insurance rates and the zoning districts.
Is Madison going to the 200-year on the South Fork?
No, not that I know of. And what Madison has said is they're several years out from remapping on the South Fork because they've got these construction projects,
Yeah.
like Eric mentioned, And they don't want to deal with remapping until they're done with those projects. In fact,
So-
I shouldn't even say remapping because there's no map.
Yeah. So by June, they're supposed to have an answer whether they're opening up culverts, number of roadways, plus building a storage facility to handle the difference.
Or do you recall if it's June? I don't remember if they gave us timing.
I thought it was June because I was surprised at how long it was gonna take to redo the model. Like,
Right.
what are you doing?
That sounds right, June.
I know,
Jojo responded with, but it was kind of a,
maybe,
I'll get you an answer later.
yeah,
So I don't know if their storage facility they're building is not big enough to handle the increased flows from larger culverts.
I know I'm trying to remember the details of their project, but
Well, I think
remember,
that's
Eric?
exactly what she was having to remodel, were the downstream culverts and whether or not they could open them further.
they had initially said there won't be any change in flows, and I think they discovered a problem with their modeling.
There were changes in flows.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they get it done by June, that won't affect right out of a 2 or 3 year period, as long as it meets the flows that you use, and it probably won't be that much difference.
Right,
So it shouldn't,
yeah,
especially as it gets sprouted through South Pond, it probably shouldn't make a big difference. Hopefully,
hopefully, I mean, they have said that, I don't know if they committing is the right word, but they're certainly trying to not change the flows. So you would think that one single project should not have a drastic effect, but
part of what Madison was doing though is trying to solve local flooding problems because they're having backwater from
yeah,
roadways. And so a way to get around that is bigger culverts, and then the local problems go away, but downstream have a problem.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So, this illustrates, one of the many wrinkles that have to get ironed out as you go through this process, but that can be done.
So there is funding approved in the budget for this work.
In our budget,
Already approved.
Yeah, there's 35,500 in the 2024 budget, and there was 34,000 in 2023, which we used none of, and that should all be carried over.
I think we should,
so we'll be looking for a motion for approval of this project.
Recommend approval, yes, so the first two
Phase one. phase two.
phases.
I'll make that motion again, phase one, phase two approval.
I'll second it. Especially since the money's already there.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion's carried for the phase 1 and phase 2.
When
Okay,
you present
thank
to
you.
council, make it much, much simpler.
I will look back.
Because
I've got
Good
a
luck.
dozen
Good luck,
slides from 4 years ago.
Yeah.
It's
you've got a
it's very high
completely,
level.
you've got a completely brand new council.
Yeah.
From when the flood occurred.
And Eric, I guess I'll ask a question. Maybe this is something to talk about later, but maybe since we have the commission here. Procedurally, the commission has made a recommendation to proceed with the FEMA remapping. I assume that recommendation should go to the council along with, me showing up and presenting.
Absolutely, yeah.
I assume a discussion of the pros and cons of going through the FEMA process versus not doing it and having the information is kind of local zoning and other use would make sense, but want to make sure what I'm presenting is in line with staff and the commission.
I guess, I don't know if they read our minutes or Randall carries the torch for our comments or what, I don't know.
Yeah.
I would say they don't get enough, even if they all read the minutes in detail, they're not going to get enough information.
Right.
Considering their backgrounds to understand it.
And they won't remember it either. Well, I don't know when you can make a presentation.
To
Couple
to
of
the
months.
city,
A couple of months perhaps,
sure.
and I think it makes sense to keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've got things like why update the maps, what's changed in the watershed, more development,
Yeah.
bigger floods. How are the maps used? That sort of thing, like. Why bother? What are these maps?
Yeah,
Well,
should we-
yeah, I mean, the decision item is really, are we gonna move forward with the full-blown FEMA
So,
process?
Kind of the pros and cons of.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah,
I think you're gonna wanna make sure to mention the flood insurance impacts that new properties will now be getting requirements for flood insurance that were not before. And it's because now they're gonna be, in fact, they're getting wet, so it's a good thing, but the landowner may not see it that way, right?
Yeah, they usually don't.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but
but
that's maybe missing the forest for the trees. But
that's very relevant for
But nonetheless, the council needs to be made aware that. they can
around
expect-
any of the vacant property around Costco.
yeah,
And we want to develop that.
yeah. So there would be a large number of properties that would become in the floodplain and
Right.
subject to those flood insurance requirements, basically, much bigger area around Costco and the South Fork,
Right.
be all new.
Mhm.
But the good news is they may pay higher rates, but they might be aware that they're in the floodplain and do something to flood-proof their building.
Right,
Yeah.
right, and I think more eligible perhaps for assistance. I guess I need to get up to speed on
Yeah.
that, but
I think that we should bring that up too. Won't the city itself be more eligible for assistance once this is actually mapped through FEMA?
Yeah,
Doesn't that open up some grant pathways for us? For some
I would think
mitigation
it
work?
should for additional properties. I mean, the city is already part of the National Flood Insurance Program and is in compliance. But to the extent that there are more properties and residents in the floodplain, I think that's possible, but I don't have a definitive answer on that right now. But let me look into that.
I do, I work for a bank and commercial lending. And I will say in 2018, we had a loan to someone in Cross Plains. And we made them get flood insurance because they were near the creek in Cross Plains. And they hated it. They don't want to do flood insurance. After 2018, they're, thank God you moved me. Insurance. So yeah, I mean, I can see people doing that, but there are examples of businesses that after a big flood, they were very grateful that they had the insurance and that the bank insisted that they have the insurance.
Randall, a question for you on that example. Was the property in a mapped floodplain or not in a mapped floodplain?
I believe it was the one I'm thinking of.
Okay.
Yeah. And the bank requires it
Yeah,
anytime
sure.
it's mapped in a floodplain.
Sure.
They won't do the loan without it.
Right. Makes sense.
Do you think of banks would look at local information that was not from FEMA?
Our bank never did, so I don't know what other banks would do, but
which bank did you work?
this, at the time it was Monona Bank.
Okay.
Because
Because I could ask my son.
Local information might be good, but it might be hard to find.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Where do you
and
find it,
and basically the process was we had a contract with someone who would supply the flood maps and say, this is in a flood zone or this isn't, and then. You know, basically if the property had a building on it, then.
I mean, one way people could find it would be if the new maps were pulled into the city's zoning code. I don't know if that's a place where lending institutions and others would look, but
And
they would be.
I don't think so. I think most banks would.
Is there a layer within access Dane for flood maps?
There's a layer that shows the FEMA flood
Oh.
information and access data.
An easy way to
Okay,
get
well,
to
that
it.
would be reason to have all this done. then,
Yeah,
because that would make it easier for people wanting to build.
okay, is there anything else on that?
Did we vote?
Yes,
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
We did.
Okay.
It was close.
It's not. Well, you want to adjourn the final meeting of,
Right, so I move for adjournment, meeting's adjourned.
and Ken, did you answer saying you don't want to be reappointed?
Yeah,
Was submerged.
think I've
I
done
was
my
in
time.
the ground and
Well, I bought you a cake,
oh, okay.
grade was above me.
so Steve, you're welcome to stick around. Jim, you're missing cake.
Yeah, I know, and that's probably not a bad thing. I've been kind of a little
County
bit sick
Liquor
lately, but
Commission.
Ken, you're just getting
I
warmed
was,
up. You can't
I
leave
gotta get
now.
some
I
younger
don't
people
understand.
here.